Okay, this is gonna be the one. It's gonna be in here. We got this. So today I want to talk to you about failure states. You're jumping across a series of moving platforms but mistime a jump and fall down a pit. You're fighting a horde of enemies and get overwhelmed and lose all of your health. Or maybe you're doing everything right, but then the boss pulls a cheap shot and drains all your HP in one go. All of these are failure states, but there are also scenarios where the player character dies. It's easy to show failure through unmistakable death, but that is not by any means the only way to communicate to the player that they messed up. In some cases, it's a time limit running out. Maybe it's a failure to protect something, a failure to escort someone to a designated location. Sometimes it's as simple and arcadey as a generic game over screen. And even still, there are many examples that are very specific to the games they take place in. Sometimes games don't even have a built-in failure state, but can still give players the sense of failure when they don't accomplish a goal they set themselves. There are a lot of ways to fail in games, but sometimes how a game handles these failure states can really determine how frustrating the experience might be. Back in the days of the arcades, failure meant you had to restart the game completely from the beginning, but the further away we get from that era, the less sense that ideology makes. After all, the point of arcade games was to make sure you eventually lose. That way you would insert more quarters and keep trying over and over again. But with the home console or computer, you already own the game, there's no more quarters to insert. As a result, games nowadays have to find a balance, so that players will still feel bad for their mistakes but won't breeze through the game or throw their controllers in frustration. Games like Super Meat Boy manage to be incredibly challenging without being frustrating because they feature short levels and fast load times. This means the players won't have much time to sit and think about how stupid their mistake was. It encourages players to keep on trying until they finally succeed. Unfortunately, these games aren't as common as you'd expect, and many games are still trying to figure out how to pull off this balance properly. This is where our garlic-loving, fat, smelly bad guy comes in. Wario games have been experimenting with failure ever since Super Mario Land 3 came out on the original Game Boy, shocking its audience with a surprising role reversal no one saw coming. See, in Wario Land 1, Wario needed to get a new castle after Mario took his back from Wario in the last game, Super Mario Land 2. In order to afford a palace worthy of the Wario title, he would need to get a lot of money. Depending on how much money was obtained by the end of the game, Wario would get a different castle. The key difference between Mario Land and Wario Land was a shift in focus. Mario is about platforming through simple levels and getting to the goal at the end of the stage. Wario, meanwhile, was about puzzle solving and exploring. To fit with this new approach, enemies were far less of a concern to Wario than they might have been to Mario. Instead of being used as an obstacle, enemies were more seen as a tool than anything else. As the series evolved, enemies could be used for far more versatile things, but even in Wario Land 1, you can make some easy money by throwing some basic dudes into a bird with a basket on his head. Aside from this new focus, however, the first two Wario Land games were still very derivative of the Mario formula, as shown by power-ups which clearly originated from their Mario counterparts. But when the third Wario Land game, appropriately titled Wario Land 2, released in 1998, it changed up the formula entirely by removing one key element, a way to die. That's right, in Wario Land 2 and 3, Wario is entirely invincible, and absolutely nothing can damage him. There is no fall too high, no hazard too dangerous, no enemy too strong. In Wario Land 3, there is only one possible instance where you could ever see a game over screen, and in Wario Land 2, it isn't ever possible. But like I said, you don't need a game over screen to experience failure. In fact, there are many failure states in both of these games. Here's a part of Wario Land 3 that looks very similar to many other platforming games, jumping across a series of cloud platforms with some enemies patrolling. In this area, the sun is actually an enemy as well. It sprays fire around in an attempt to scorch Wario. In any other game, this would be pretty intimidating, but because Wario can't die, there's no threat, right? Comparing this scenario to another scenario in a more iconic platforming game, one key difference becomes clear. In the Mario game, when you miss a platform, you fall, you die, you lose a life, and have to start the level over. But in Wario Land 3, missing the jump doesn't kill you, but it does send you to the room below. See how this works? You may not be able to die in Wario Land 3, but you can still experience failure. This has been done in a few other games as well, such as Super Mario Sunshine. In that game, there were very few bottomless pits in the main stages, so if you fell, the punishment wasn't death, but the fall itself. Just like in Wario Land. Sunshine is perhaps one of the worst examples of this design philosophy because in many cases it took more time to get back to the challenge than it did to actually complete it. Luckily, in this example, the area you fell down is directly connected to the room above, so it won't take very long to get back up and try again. So enemies can't hurt or kill Wario in these games, but they can alter his current state of being. Instead of collecting power-ups from mysterious blocks with question marks on them, the key source of power for Wario are the very creatures fighting against him. If you get stung by a bee, you face a serious allergic reaction and start floating upward. If you get crushed by a rock, you flatten and gain the ability to slowly float downward. It's cartoony and hilarious, but practical. That knowledge, when combined with his innovative failure state, makes that sun a lot more intimidating than it once was. If the sun hit you in Mario, you just lose your power-up. But if the sun hits you in Wario, your rear end will literally light on fire, and who knows where Wario will end up when that happens. This logic also extends to the boss battles. Every single attack from most bosses is designed to not damage you, but instead knock you out of the room you're fighting them in. Nothing's worse than getting hit by a hammer in the middle of a boss fight and having to bounce out of the room. Now you have to make your way all the way back to the boss room. That's the punishment. I like Wario Land 2, but Wario Land 3 is the far superior game in my opinion. Not only were the levels designed more consistently with this in mind, but having to revisit old levels with new abilities forces players to remember how these levels are laid out and understand the enemy placement and behavior better. For a puzzle platformer, that's the perfect setup for the more methodical gameplay. But as much as I'd love to keep talking about these gems, I've got another stinker to talk about today. This one wasn't developed by the same team as the prior Wario Land games. Instead, it was a project by Treasure, the company behind Gunstar Heroes, Sin and Punishment, and Mischief Makers, among others. So not exactly the guys you'd expect making a game about this adorable face. That said, the name Treasure is so wonderfully appropriate that I can't help but think that this pairing was destined to happen. Welcome to Wario World. When I first played Wario World on GameCube, I really didn't know what to make of it. I enjoyed playing it, but it also really frustrated me. It was a game that I could only play in short bursts before wanting to throw my controller and burst out of the room. But then, later that same day, I'd suddenly feel the desire to play it again. It does so many things right, but where it fails is, well, with failure. Before we get there though, let's discuss everything that this game does well to provide better context. That way we can understand how Wario World's poor communication of failure really breaks everything it does so well to establish. The setup here is typical anti-hero fare. Wario's got a wealth of money and jewels in his newly built castle, but one of those jewels is actually an evil sentient being, because of course it is. This being, called the Black Jewel, suddenly takes over Wario's castle and turns all of his wealth into a horde of evil monsters. The only way to get the money back is to stop the Black Jewel, so it's up to Wario to save the day, and more importantly, his wallet. The game is divided up into 4 worlds with 2 levels and a boss fight in each one. That totals out to an incredibly small sounding 8 levels, but each level is chock full of various collectibles including gems, treasure, and spritelings, taking upwards of 30 minutes to fully complete. It's a collectathon in every sense of the term, but instead of applying that formula to the stereotypical 3D platformer like many other games at the time used, Wario World uses a 3D action beat-em-up as the base. Because of that, Wario World is a lot more fun and mindless than many other games in the Mario universe. There's a lot of really obnoxious and unnecessary combos Wario can use to take out his enemies, but ridiculous as they may be, they're incredibly satisfying to pull off, and they aren't convoluted enough to confuse people who just want to have a good time. When you use these combos to defeat enemies, they explode into the very treasure they were made out of. Then you can use Wario's sheer greed to freaking inhale the shiny gold coins and make sure you didn't miss any. If that isn't entertaining, I don't know what is. Either way, these combos also serve an ulterior purpose. As I mentioned, in the Wario Land games, enemies are used more as tools than actual obstacles. If there is a block you couldn't break, usually throwing an enemy at the block would do the trick just as well. Here, Treasure made the right call in deciding that having enemies alter Wario's state of being like in Wario Land 2 and 3 will be really difficult to implement elegantly in a 3D space, so they instead used the combo system to serve a similar purpose. Need to rotate a switch? The only way to do that is to spin an enemy around and hit it. Is that practical? Well, no. But it sure does look fun, and it fits Wario perfectly. Similarly, there are certain metal trapdoors that can't be opened by a ground pound alone. For that, you'll need to dive bomb an enemy into the door to force it open. Once again, incredibly impractical, but stupid enough to work in a Wario game. These trapdoors lead to another great element of the game, these puzzle rooms. They essentially act as a foil to the constant action of the overworld by presenting Wario with a mind-bending puzzle to complete. Some of these puzzles are more so platforming challenges than actual puzzles, but the platforming is much more tactical than the typical Mario fare, requiring a lot more navigational thought than one might be used to. One of my favorite puzzles is this one right here, which has Wario hit a series of blocks in a certain order in order to create a bridge to the gem in the middle. It's extremely challenging, but paid off in spades when I finally figured it all out. This is something that I feel many other beat-em-up action games could use, because in a lot of cases these sorts of games can get incredibly monotonous with constantly mashing the same buttons over and over again. Another aspect that really works in the game's favor is the wide array of scenery it offers. People often joke about the environment formula you often see in Mario titles: grass, desert, ocean, forest, ice, mountain, sky, lava. This formula used to just apply to the main series Mario games, but recently this trend has even extended itself as far as the RPGs. Surprisingly and thankfully, Wario World's 8 levels are incredibly diverse and unique, and even when they use the generic world themes like forest or ice, they pull it off in a completely different way that makes it stand out. There's a circus, a haunted house, a house of mirrors, themes that you just really wouldn't expect in a game like this, but just work. Despite the game having more climactic boss battles at the end of every world, each level also culminates in a boss fight, and pretty much every one of these battles are interesting and fun, with the unfortunate exception of the final boss. In order to access these level bosses, a certain number of gems must be collected in the level, playing to the game's collectathon strengths without demanding 100% completion. All this said, it makes for one of the most interesting experiments on the GameCube and one of the most unique collectathon and beat-em-up games of its kind. Unfortunately though, it just doesn't handle failure as brilliantly as past Wario titles, and this cripples the game experience to a point of frustration. Now, if we're talking about failure, we have to consider the possible conditions on which we can deem the player as having failed. In a platformer like Wario Land, it's easy. If you fall from the platforms you're jumping across, you failed. As previously discussed, the enemies in these games were designed around inconveniencing your platforming rather than killing you outright, because, at least in Wario Land 2 and 3, they can't kill you. Wario World isn't a platformer though, it's a beat 'em up, so we're gonna have to change how things work. Because combat is more important, Wario needs to have a health bar, because if not, the core gameplay is completely trivialized. In addition, there are some platforming elements in these levels, so we can consider falling off of these platforms to be a failure state as well. It's a bit more complex than the 2D game's one failure state, but a certain other game series featuring a different mustachioed Italian man also has these two parameters, so it shouldn't have been too hard for Treasure to make this work. Let's focus on the platforming first. Unlike Wario Land 3, the level design here is much more horizontal in nature, meaning that if Wario falls, he's going to be falling into a bottomless pit. In a game like, say, Mario, falling into a bottomless pit would result in death, followed by the loss of a life and the chance to retry at the beginning or at a checkpoint partway through the level. In Wario, however, this isn't the case. The so-called bottomless pits actually have a bottom. In these rooms, Wario must break a ton of boxes while being chased by some ghosts, with the goal of finding a box that has a spring inside. If the ghosts catch Wario, they'll take away a bunch of his money and then let him go. Some poisonous water in parts of the room can also make Wario lose money. When he finds the spring, he can then bounce out of the death room and resume the level from the exact point where he died. It's something I've never seen in a game before, but it's incredibly flawed because there's no real consequence for dying other than wasted time. If you fall into a pit, that's at least 45 seconds of your time that you can't get back for breaking those boxes. 45 seconds may not seem that long, but it absolutely adds up over time, especially when playing some of the more difficult sections near the game's end. There's one other thing Wario loses when he falls, but I'll get to that a bit later. Comparing this to a more traditional 2D platformer like Super Mario Bros., Wario World actually has the player take less time to get back to where they were in the level, but at least the time spent getting back to where they last died in the typical platformer is somewhat enjoyable. All Wario World provides here is tedium. It wasn't fun the first time, and it isn't fun the 87th time. The other problem here is that Mario sets a skill standard that players have to meet in order to beat the game, where Wario World doesn't. In Wario World, a player of any skill will inevitably make it to the end of the level, regardless of how many times they die. There's no consequence for death other than added time, so there's never any point where the game demands skill. Mario makes that impossible though, because players eventually have to make that perfect run from the start to the end of the level without falling down a pit or dying. Past Wario games didn't have that problem, because the levels were designed with that idea in mind. In a section of the level where the game demands skill, missing a jump would lead the player to the same beginning location, so that way they have to do the entire challenge over again. With that in mind, there's a super easy fix for this problem which would have completely changed how players viewed the game. Instead of the spring bouncing players back to the precise point where they died, it should instead lead to designated platforms across the level which essentially act as checkpoints. This keeps everything the game already had, but it also allows for a higher skill floor which gives the game a proper difficulty curve. Unfortunately, that doesn't completely solve the problem because the death rooms are still tedious, but there are ways to keep the same general idea without making it as repetitive. For example, instead of being chased by ghosts which take your money, how about presenting players with a choice on how to spend their money? Let's suppose, for example, that dying not only set back your progress in the level, but it also took away some of the treasure you collected thus far. This adds an element of risk that wasn't there previously, but to prevent the tedium of the death rooms being reincarnated in the form of long stretches of replaying prior parts of the level, players could opt to pay more money to get their treasure back. Even better, let's go full on Dark Souls with this design philosophy. How about, if you fall down a pit, all of your treasure manifests as a box on a platform near where you died. This means that players could take the risk of essentially corpse running back to where they died, or they could pay money in the death room to remove that risk. I'm less certain about that addition, but it's certainly something worth considering. But maybe this is pointless. After all, there's another form of failure in Wario World with the health bar, so perhaps Treasure wanted to focus on that instead. Unfortunately, that isn't the case either. Throughout the level, there are these garlic shopkeepers which sell you health in exchange for an ever-increasing amount of money. At first, I thought this was an interesting risk versus reward mechanic similar to what I suggested they do to the death rooms, but the second I died, I realized it was completely pointless. That's because when you die in Wario World, the only thing you lose is a small amount of money. Just like an arcade machine, the game asks if you want to continue and then takes some money in exchange, after which the game continues and acts as if nothing happened. This decision is so incredibly baffling that I can't even put it into words. This trivializes everything in the game, even more so than the death rooms. At least there, the player is minorly inconvenienced for failing, but here there is no tangible loss. And to clarify, money is not a tangible loss in this game, because it has absolutely no bearing on anything that happens in the game whatsoever. I expected money to, at the very least, play a role in the ending, like in the first Wario Land, but the size of Wario's castle is instead determined by the amount of spritlings Wario rescues. Because money plays no other role in the game, the money instead acts as an extended life bar of sorts for Wario, limiting the amount of times Wario can die, as, in theory, Wario can only die as many times as he can bail himself out of. The problem is that money is so incredibly prevalent in this game that it's impossible for that well to ever run dry. All you have to do is punch a few dudes and you'll easily recover any money lost by dying. The more money you have, the more you'll lose upon death, but if you have more money, that also means you've died less and are likely to make up any lost profit before dying again. This makes for a game which is incredibly mindless fun, but is also painfully easy and painfully tedious. There doesn't need to be any major stakes for a game to be enjoyable, but there has to at least be something, so that players feel like their actions and skill level matter. The solution here is to make money more valuable to players. This makes them, in effect, as greedy as Wario, because if loss of money affects players' ability to succeed, then they will treasure it much more. My suggestion is to remove the life bar entirely and make Wario's wallet his life bar. Instead of the game keeping track of total accumulated money throughout, we'll have Wario only carry the money collected in each stage. This means that he starts at effectively no health at the start of every level and has to collect money in order to live. The mechanic is very similar to the Sonic games, but without its one fatal flaw. Enemies won't knock away all of Wario's money with one hit, because that means having 1 gold is effectively the same as having 1,000 gold. Treasure would have to experiment with how much gold should be lost with each hit to appropriately balance the game, but even a poorly balanced version of this mechanic would work a lot better than the current system. If Wario's wallet health is depleted, then the same thing would happen as if Wario fell down a pit. All collectibles gained so far in the level would be lost, and the same choice would be presented to Wario in the death room, allowing him to pull from his collected gold from other levels to get those collectibles back without having to retread old ground. Whether you like or dislike my ideas for the game, however, the fact remains that the game in its current state is incredibly flawed, despite being incredibly fun. Had there been actual stakes in this game, I feel like the gameplay would have taken center stage and fighting enemies would have been far more captivating and interesting than it is now. Wario World is a super short game, but the level design here is top-notch throughout, and I'd rather have a short game that does so much right than have a long game that drags on. It's just a shame that one mistake can kill an entire game like this. The problem isn't just exclusive to Wario World, however. There are tons of otherwise fantastic games that have been trivialized by a lack of true consequence. Banjo-Tooie, for example, has no consequence for death whatsoever, to the point that many speedruns of the game feature dozens of instances where players intentionally die to get to a certain location faster. My favorite 3D platformer, SpongeBob Battle for Bikini Bottom, don't judge, also has this issue, as there are checkpoints that players activate, but there are many instances where you respawn right next to where you died instead of at the checkpoint. I just think the problem is most prevalent here in Wario World because of the fact that it's a beat-em-up. Nothing in this game is particularly hard on its own, but it's damn fun. If there was a reason to actually fear death, then the game would be elevated to a much higher pedigree, and I bet more people would respect it for the otherwise well-made game that it is.
Wait a minute. I got it! It's here!
I've got the spring. Now I can finally escape. Put it down here.
Ready? 1, 2. Oh.
Thank you all so much for watching this video on Wario World and a few other Wario games as well. I love Wario Land 3, I couldn't help but mention it, and also it's very relevant to the topic at hand. What do you think should be done to fix Wario World's death mechanic? If Nintendo and Treasure, they were like, you know, we're gonna fix Wario World, what would you do to fix this problem? Or do you think it even is a problem? Do you think it needs to be fixed? Is it fine the way it is? Let me know in the comments below, and give me any feedback. I always appreciate feedback down in the comments section. I got a lot of good feedback on the last gaming-related video I did, and I also got some great feedback on the first music-related video on this channel, which is a critical analysis of Metallica's Saint Anger. If you haven't checked out either of those videos, highly recommend it. The links will be coming after this end card in a few seconds here, so stay tuned for that. Thank you all once again for watching. There'll be more videos coming soon. Subscribe if you want to see more. If you don't, then don't. That's fine. Peace. Because if not, the core game... Dark Souls 2 coming soon. Mixtape. Wario World isn't a platformer, though. God damn it.